And thanks for doing it.
Okay, my pleasure. Well, my first question to you is, how did you get started as a writer? How did your career as a writer begin?
I think it goes back really to part of it is growing up in the South, and in a family that loved to tell stories, and a lot of those stories were about history, and so that was just part of growing up. It was like in the air, and I think a lot of Southern writers, have experienced that growing up. For me, more specifically, though, I think it was growing up, coming of age kind of in the decade of the 1960s, and there was just so much dramatic stuff going on in the world, and I was struck by the complexity of it sometime, and the complications of the human condition, and how good people sometimes did things that weren't good, and I just there was the war, and there was in Vietnam, and there was the civil rights movement, and there were the protests, and my way of encountering all that was to try to write about it first as a student journalist, and then as a young newspaper journalist, just to try to figure out what was going on. So I really think that's what kick-started me into the whole process.
Yeah, history is very important, and it's a big inspiration for writing, and it happened, history, past, present, and the future,
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Do you have any upcoming works you can talk about, or?
Well, I have a book that is coming out this fall. That's actually a story about the life of my wife, Nancy Gaillard, who died 2 years ago from leukemia. And she was an educator. Yeah, thanks. She was an educator, and so it's a kind of memoir about her life as a teacher. The book is called "Live as If." ... and then the subtitle is A Teacher's Love Story. Live as If is taken from her favorite quote from Gandhi, which is, "Live as if you will die tomorrow, learn as if you will live forever." And so it's her story as a teacher in public education and a principal, and how public education can go right when there's enough love injected into that process. And then woven through it is the story of Nancy and me, and our relationship. So it's very personal, but hopefully more than just catharsis for me. And it's being published by a small press that normally specializes in poetry and fiction, called Negative Capability Press, which is run by Sue Walker, the former poet laureate of Alabama. And so it'll be out sometime this fall, and I'm excited about it. It was a book that was close to my heart. And then I have two other books that have come out, fairly recently. One is a children's book about the first black congressman from Alabama. It's called The Slave Who Went to Congress. And I wrote it with a good friend of mine named Marty Rosner. Marty and I have known each other for years, and she was a teacher for a long time and knows about children's literature. So we wrote this true story about a black congressman during Reconstruction, and his sort of Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela type sensibilities about justice and reconciliation. And then before that, in 2018, I had a long book on the decade of the 60s called A Hard Rain, America in the 1960s. So those are the most recent projects, and, it's kept me busy, and that's good.
Absolutely. It's good to keep busy, especially if you enjoy doing it,
Yeah, and I do.
Absolutely. My next question is, what do you find is the most challenging or difficult aspects of being a writer?
There's a lot of solitude involved in being a writer, I think, and sometimes you're just kind of locked in a struggle with yourself to figure out the story inside you that you want to tell, to figure out the right words to tell it. I'm always, when I'm engaged in that process, reminded of what Johnny Cash once said about songwriting. He said, hell, if it was easy, everybody would do it. Well, I think writing books is kind of that way too. It's just, it doesn't get any easier. At least it never has for me, but it's just, it's so satisfying once it's done, once you've told a story. And I usually tell other people's stories. I write nonfiction, but I usually tell other people's stories much more than my own, just because I tend to find those stories more interesting. And if you think you've done right by telling another person's story, which is a big responsibility, then I just find that deeply satisfying. So, it's worth the sweat.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's probably one of the joys for a writer, telling your fans or the readers a story, and they just get hooked to it, And it's really fun to do it ultimately, and I love the process of then getting out and talking to people about a book, and right now, with COVID, you really can't do that. And so that's kind of hard, not being able to really connect with readers in that personal way that sometimes you get to do. Although ultimately a book's got to speak for itself, but I still enjoy getting out there and talking to students or people in bookstores or libraries or wherever it might be. So, yeah, absolutely. So you write just nonfiction? Do you write fiction sometimes, or mostly just nonfiction?
Mostly it's nonfiction. I wrote a novella, like a 70-page short historical novel for young readers a couple of years ago. It was called Go South to Freedom, and it was based on an oral history that an elderly African-American friend of mine told me about his own ancestors and how they were enslaved on a Georgia plantation and ran away one night and got lost in a thunderstorm that blotted out the stars, and they couldn't see where they were going. They didn't have the stars to guide them, the North Star. And they discovered that the next day that they had been running south all night instead of north, and they were filled with despair. But then finally figured out that a lot of people who had been enslaved did run away to the south, and sometimes found shelter with the Seminole Indians in Florida, and sometimes found sanctuary in coastal cities like Mobile and New Orleans, where there were free people of color who sometimes would take in runaways even at their own peril. And so my friend's family had done both. They had spent a little time with the Seminole Indians and then had come to Mobile where they lived. So I turned that true oral history into, I sort of expanded it and used my imagination a little bit and made it into a historical novel for young readers. That's really the only real successful attempt I've made at writing something that was fiction, and yet it too was based on a true story. So the short answer is I stay
pretty tethered to the literal truth as much as I can. I just find I write that better than I do when I'm making stuff up out of whole cloth, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nonfiction I think is more informative and more enjoyable because it is the truth, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I admire fiction writers, and I admire, you know, poets and people who do that other stuff. And, you know, probably if I were better at it, I might do it more, might try it more often. But I just think you can tell a story that's a true story, literally a true story, as best you can discern that, and still make it as interesting as a novel if you just do your homework and just write it well enough, you know. So that's the creative challenge with nonfiction, is just to make sure the story comes through as a story so that it entertains and moves people as well as informing them.
Absolutely. Yeah, reading and writing, it's a very important aspect in our lives, you know, and especially now with the coronavirus, I think people, you know, like you said, you know, it's just difficult all around with the coronavirus and just...
Yeah, no doubt. And, you know, and I know a lot of people who are reading more these days, you know. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, I've had a chance to read more for pleasure in the last 3 or 4 months. I do a lot of reading for research, but, you know, just reading for pure pleasure, I've done that a lot in the last 3 or 4 months, and it's just been wonderful, you know, just to kind of sink in with a good book, you know.
Absolutely. And where can people find your books? Do you have a website, or are you on Amazon?
I do. Yeah, I do have a website. It's called FryeGaillard.com. And that's my name, FryeGaillard.com. And the website, it's all one word. Frye Gaillard is one word. And so that has a complete list. And then you can Google or go to Amazon.com, and, you know, most of the stuff that is still in print, you know, will be listed there. So, you know, so it's not too hard to find. The most recent books I've done have mostly been published by really good award-winning independent press in Montgomery called New South Books. They're smaller than the New York houses, but actually a pretty good-sized press, and they do a wonderful job with their books and have a lot of fine authors. I'm really happy to be on that roster. So people can also Google New South Books and look not only for me, but for other writers that they publish.
Absolutely. My next question to you is, what is your advice to people who want to be a writer or who want to get into writing?
Well, I think, you know, a couple of things occurred to me. One is that when I was first starting out, and I was asking more seasoned writers, how do you get better at this? You know, how do you get better at telling a story? And one guy, a mentor of mine, who was the Atlanta bureau chief of Newsweek magazine, his name was Joe Cumming, Cumming. Joe is this wonderful guy, and he said, there are only two things you can do to get better as a writer, and one is to read, and the other is just to write. You know, just do it. And he went on to say that reading with a critical eye, thinking about, okay, why is this book that I'm reading, why does it work for me? Why does it move me? What is the writer doing to tell this story effectively? And so to be kind of an active reader and a critical reader and think about what's happening on those pages that you're reading, that's really important. And then the other is just doing it enough, practicing it enough until you develop your own voice.